May 11th, an idle day, inspected troops and did a little drill. Later wandered about the plains with Hammond. Early to bed. May 12th, parade and gas drill during morning. In the afternoon played a cricket match against some Army Service Corps neighbours. They entertained us with tea and a very excellent concert in a marquee. One turn was particularly good. A sister to a sister. May 13th, Sunday. We spent the day preparing to move up the line and were given maps of our new position, which is just below Bullecourt, in front of Quant and Pronville. At dusk we moved off, I marching in front with Ewing. Following a track along the edge of a small wood, we passed another battalion lying down. We also halted until it was dark enough to proceed. Then, half an hour late, we set off along the main cobbled road leading to Cambrai. For an hour we marched in perfect quiet, and then far ahead was a flash followed by the boom of one of our guns. Almost at the same moment we had to spread out to avoid a shell hole. From there on the shell holes became more frequent, and the road was littered with the large, loose cobbles. The gun was firing at intervals of exactly 2 minutes, until at last we reached its position and halted for a rest before striking off across the fields for the final stage. The rain, of course, had started, and things seemed pretty miserable to me as I lay in the wet grass in full pack with the front line half a mile off. Pushing on, we moved across a faint track and had just climbed onto an open plain when the order gas alert was passed back. We got our gas masks ready, but save for a slight smell of pineapple, there was no development. Presently guides arrived and we were led away to the right, whilst the rest of the battalion carried on. Passing in single file through the long grass over several disused trenches, we had the usual trouble with our guide, who, not having any equipment to hamper him, was dashing on at a high speed in his anxiety to get the relief over. At the trench wherein we learnt was the company HQ dugout, we picked up one guide per platoon, and took our separate paths to the front line I to the left, Radcliffe centre, Harding to the right. Hammond, Pepper and Ewing remained with 16 platoon in the HQ trench. A gradual downward slope of 200 yards brought us to a trench barely 20 yards long. Here an officer greeted me and climbed up on top. I dropped Dunham, Sergeant Jowett and the reserve section, and the remainder of us went forward to the line of posts in front. There were only 2 for me to hold, and these I placed in the charge of Corporals Mackay and Wood. Having posted these sections, we returned to the trench behind and climbed down the slippery earth steps. A small cubbyhole had been scooped into the front of the trench, and into this we crawled. There was just room for us to lie full length on the straw, with a candle stuck between us on a piece of stick jabbed into the side. Here I signed for the stores of bombs, very lights, ammunition and petrol tins which I had checked, and I asked the officer if he had any tips to give me about the trench. He told me that everything was very quiet, but that no one could move by day. At night, Jerry had strong patrols out in no man's land, but his line was 1,000 yards away. May 14th. Then we being mutually satisfied, he led his platoon away, and I dispatched Dunham to HQ with my relief complete message. I then took Sergeant Jowett and Edge, the runner, across the 80 yards which separated us from our left post. Here there was a steep bank about 10 feet high running towards the enemy, and in the side was a nice cosy dugout where Corporals Harrison and Newey were issuing rations to the men not on sentry. About 10 yards forward along the bank were Julian and Hayne lying in the grass. When I spoke to them, they sounded very bloodthirsty. They said they were longing for a scrap and showed me a small pile of bombs they were itching to use. Then I went back to the trench, which although deep at the posts is only knee-deep for the 100 yards which led to number 41 post, where Mackay had his Lewis gun team. They were also very cheery, and Mac touched me for some tobacco to the great amusement of Sergeant Jowett, who told me that Mac had never bought a scrap of baccy, but was never without a smoke. I then sent Jowett back and continued alone to the right, following the barbed wire, until in a few minutes I met Radcliffe coming to meet me. We walked back together to my posts, and then decided to break the ice thoroughly by going out into no man's land. I felt awfully frightened, and my heart beat very high as for the first time I passed through the wire into the silence and mystery of the unknown ground. The moon was giving a faint light through the clouds, which enabled us to see dimly for about 50 yards. For about 100 yards we walked slowly forward, seeing nothing but grass and occasionally a shell hole. Then suddenly Radcliffe grasped my arm and pulled me quietly but quickly down into the long grass. Holding my breath, I heard a faint but distinct rustle of knees ploughing through clover, and then dimly in front I saw a small party of men approaching us. They halted 40 yards away, and I lay frozen with fear and excitement. But Radcliffe was gurgling with laughter. I punched him in the ribs, but he breathed gurglingly. "They didn't reckon on my trench club." And he shoved forward the thin, swishy cane he had brought with him. The party now moved slowly across to our left, jabbing the long grass with their bayonets, whilst we crawled swiftly backwards to the trench. We got Mackay to bring his gun out in front, but did not let him fire as the party had now moved on to the front of the Australians on our left. We left him on the alert and then went back to Harrison's post. As we got into the trench, there was a crack and a spluttering swish as a very light shot up from the Australian's post and burst into a vivid white flame overhead. A fraction of a second later, there was a burst of rifle and Lewis gunfire, and Mackay's gun opened on our right. As a second light shot up, I just saw faint figures in front, running and dropping. Then there was quiet and a darkness more intense than before. A minute later, a long burst of machine gun fire swept over us, sending us ducking to the bottom of the trench. Then there was perfect quiet, and I took Raddy back to my little cubbyhole, where Dunham had laid out my blanket, oil sheet, rations, cigarettes, and a bottle of port. We took turns at drinking port from a tin mug. Then Raddy went back to his posts, and I began to draw a map of the position, and made out a report on the patrol. I was so pleased at having broken the ice that I felt quite anxious to get out again with a fighting patrol behind me. I was awake all night visiting the posts, thoroughly enjoying the keen, fresh air and the quiet moonlight. There was no more firing nor lights of any kind, and at 6 a.m, when day had broken, I curled up in my cubbyhole with Dunham and slept peacefully. May 15th. At about 12 noon I woke, and while Dunham still slept, I wormed my way out under the oil sheet which screened the front of our hole, and standing erect in the trench, I met a fresh, sweet breeze and clear, warm sunlight that made me glowing and alert in a moment. Raising my arms in a luxurious stretch, I rose on tiptoe and looked round the stretch of ground behind me, a slight valley of long, coarse grass, thickly strewn with poppies and dog daisies. The sweep was broken only by a faint track which led back the slope to my left towards where Ewing had remained with the reserve platoon, and any occasional shell holes. There was no sign of life and no sound save for the faint rustle of the grass on the parapet. Not even a bird was stirring, and I felt crude and coarse as I walked upon the broken rushwork of the trench floor, round the corner to where Jowett lay on his back in a cubbyhole, smoking and watching his servant Edge slicing bully for his dinner. After saying, "Good morning," I sat down at his feet and in silence lit a cigarette. He too was silent, and for some minutes we remained so, puffing blue clouds up into the clear air above the trench. The calm and silence seemed as fragile and the sky as dainty as the picture on a Dresden plate, and when finally we spoke, his voice sounded harsh and grating, but it broke an uncomfortable sentimental spell. It was a commonplace remark about the cushiness of the sector, and I answered accordingly, and then we went on to the ordinary military talk about the section formations and deficiencies of equipment. But even then I was picturing him lying thus, and smoking in a deck chair outside a cottage in his beloved Hampshire village. Leaving him and the cherubic Edge to argue with the bully, I passed on to the right, stopping to exchange a word with the occupants of each shelter, some of whom were reading an old copy of the Birmingham Post, some eating, some cleaning rifles. After a dozen yards or so, the trench became shallow and suddenly ended. Leaning out over the parapet at the end, I found Taylor. Taylor is my black sheep. He is a Birmingham rough and is always in trouble, accompanied by Dawson, who is his inseparable companion. They live, sleep, fight and get drunk together, and, I am certain, will die together. I have many times tried to get into Taylor's heart, but he is as close as an oyster and sheers off whenever I talk to him. With Dawson, however, I have quite an understanding. I choke him off and punish him as firmly as is necessary, but after it is over, we are just as chummy. So I leant over beside Taylor, and having made the obvious remark about the weather, commenced to study the view. I was very disappointed, for I had hoped to see the Boche line, but the ground rose so sharply in front that I could only see about a dozen yards of foreground, and even my own posts were not visible. And my surprise was even greater that Taylor should have been so wrapped in thought when there was nothing to study. I could not imagine him having any sentimentality which would drive him away to solitary reverie when sleep, cards, or crown and anchor were available in his shelter. I therefore threw out a few tentative remarks, but he answered very abruptly, then edged away and disappeared round the corner. After a few minutes, I followed him back to my cubbyhole, where I dragged the sleeping Dunham by his ankles, upbraiding him for wasting such delightful sunlight, especially when I wanted my lunch. Then I went on round the other corner to see Corporal Wood. Bobby was sitting in his shelter writing a letter, and he grinned amiably when I appeared. "Bit better and blighty, don't you think, sir?" I agreed that there was less worry and certainly more peace, and he climbed out of his shelter to stand with me drinking in the atmosphere. It was indeed still. Not a sound could be heard but the tinkle of a button stick in the next recess, until without warning there was a mighty crash and a spray of earth and stones fell over us as we flung ourselves against the trench side. A high-velocity shell bursting 30 yards in front had effectively broken the spell, and as Wood climbed back into his recess, I hurried back to mine, not that these holes afford the slightest protection, except against small splinters, but as a rabbit seeks its burrow, so we each dashed to our own hole for safety. Dunham was standing in the trench with a tin of pork and beans in his hand, and a look of mingled surprise and indignation on his face. His uttered opinion of Jerry was cut short by another and closer explosion, and again we grovelled until we heard the singing fragments pass overhead, when we rose and, climbing onto the steps, were in time to see the smoke drifting away from a fresh round hole around which the grass was covered with a thin layer of earth and pebbles. Well, the best antidote to fear is food, so we sat on the mouth of our hole and shared a tin of bully and beans, and I drank port whilst Dunham made tea over a Tommy's cooker. The sides of the trench heaved twice more, but the shells were no nearer. However, the silence was dispelled, and the birds were now twittering with alarm. Voices were raised in song, talk, and laughter, and as the afternoon wore on, the sky became darker, and at 5 o'clock a few spots of rain began to fall. At dusk it was raining softly. We climbed out and trudged through the long wet grass to the line where the troops were standing, to all very cheerful. I saw the sentries posted, and then walked out slowly to the right to meet Raddy, who I guessed would stroll along. As we slowly returned, everything became deathly quiet again, and it was so dark that we had to find our way by following the barbed wire. We were still in the open near the right post when I grabbed his arm and we stood motionless. I had heard the faint crack of a Granatenwerfer forgotten since Beaches, and after a faint short swish, the bomb burst with a sharp shattering crash and a spurt of yellow sparks overhead. Immediately a cold fear gripped me, for I realized instantly that there was no cover from these. It was no use lying down, for their burst was downward, and they were immediately overhead. We waited for several minutes, and as the fire was not repeated, I cheered myself by saying that this was only an accidental premature, and that the ground-busters were quite harmless. But this hope was soon shattered, for suddenly there came a persistent stream of them all bursting at the same height over our line. The fragments whizzed past us and struck the ground with horrid thuds, and our nerves were terribly racked. But reaching my post, we found the troops taking not the slightest notice of them, so in feigned nonchalance we strolled along, chaffing the NCOs and questioning the sentries, until the pineapples ceased 15 minutes later. Radcliffe was taking his patrol out from my right post, so I waited there while he went back to fetch them. Then one by one we passed through the gap in the wire and crouched in the wet grass until the formation was complete. We advanced in jumps, Raddy and I creeping forward with a runner, scenting the ground for 50 yards at a time, and then sending the runner back for the patrol. After a while we got tired of this, so we left the patrol where it was, and we two crept on alone until we reached a junction of two roads that ran across no man's land. The road was sunken, and as we approached we heard faint voices, and looking over the bank, there, hard at work digging a hole, were 8 or 10 large Boche. We were neither surprised nor alarmed. We just lay watching them amusedly for a couple of minutes, then crawled off back to the patrol. I was wondering what on earth induced them to dig holes in no man's land, when a figure almost upright hurried past us and was lost in the darkness behind. So we stood up then and ran back to where our lads were lying, chilled, wet and fed up. Quickly we told them what we had seen, and in a moment they were alert, and we set off together out for blood. Alas! When we reached the crossroads, nothing remained of the working party but a few chalky shovels, so we had to be content with firing a few rounds down the road after them, and then we walked back, laughing and talking, whilst 4 of the silly asses marched the shovels between them with great ceremony and exaggerated caution, as though they were enemy prisoners. This little jaunt has left us with our tails well up, and I, for one, am very keen on no man's land. I fully appreciate the truth of the maxim that was dinned into us during training. Fighting patrols are the finest stiffeners of morale. May 16th. The remainder of the night was uneventful, except for a breezy 5 minutes at 1:30 a.m., when one of our own 18-pounder batteries fired 24 shells straight onto our own left post, and one 9-inch shell which fell 20 yards from my cubbyhole. There were no casualties. Still overcast and drizzling at midday when I woke. I lay on my back watching tiny beetles running excitedly about my earth roof and walls, until Dunham woke and lent me his recently received copy of a Dorset local paper. I glanced through the blood-curdling description of local sewing bees and Band of Hope debaucheries. Then I tried to write a letter, but could not draw any cheerful inspiration from the drip-drip of the rain past the mouth of our hole, nor from the wet stretcher and bomb boxes outside. So I gave it up and told Dunham to join me in a whistle. In harmony we passed from the minstrel boy to marble halls, but it was too exhausting, and we relinquished that pastime in favour of an onslaught on a cold chunk of doubtful steak covered with muddy whiskers of sandbag, followed by a tin of peaches. After this sumptuous repast, I crawled out and threw the oil sheet, which had been my bed, over my shoulders, and walked round the trench. With the exception of Dredge, who was gas sentry, everybody was fast asleep, and Dredge, being very deaf and very stupid, is no good as a conversationalist. So I had perforce to pace up and down the wet, muddy crack, and yearn for a nice, long, exciting trench. Evening gave us half an hour of faint sunshine, which served only to accentuate the drabness of our surroundings. Darkness, chasing the sun down very quickly, left the sky behind us a strip of flaming red, so that I judged it wiser to wait a bit before I moved the troops forward to the front line for stand to. As I was gathering them together, I heard the sentry shout a challenge which was answered by the voice of Colonel Hanson. I climbed out and met him, receiving a terse choke-off for not having moved forward earlier. He may have believed my reason, but in any case he didn't approve it. I walked round my line with him. He had no remarks to make, and having given him a guide to Radcliffe's left post, I dropped into my right one, beside Mackay. I have never seen Mackay depressed. He was always a fund of original humour, and seeing that I was fed up, he set himself to cheer me by chaffing Corporal Newey about the latter's card losses during the afternoon. His cure was working well when I heard someone approaching from behind and went out to meet Samuel, who had come up from the reserve company to look round the line. After a few minutes' talk, he called my attention to a faint rumbling in the distance, which we at first took to be thunder, but as it rumbled nearer and nearer, we distinguished the individual boom of batteries, and knew it for an artillery barrage swelling and deepening on our left. The unrest spread across our front, and soon short bursts of rifle and machine gun fire came from Jerry's line, answered by fire from the Australians beside us. We thought we would walk over to the high ground on our left to see something of the battle that obviously was raging round Bullecourt, so we went out through the wire. We had just got in front of No 42 post when a machine gun opened at close range, and we flattened out under a stream of bullets. It lasted about half a minute, during which time I heartily wished I was on the other side of Sammy, who is large and round. Then all was quiet again, and we rose and doubled back to the line, forsaking our intention of visiting the Australians. Sammy lurched off to Radcliffe's sector, while I took 6 men out in front. May 17th. We wandered about for an hour, but it was wet and cold and miserable. We saw nothing and returned fed up to await dawn, which came an hour and a half late owing to a thick fog. I woke for lunch at 1 p.m, after which, the day being dry, though dull, I was allowing myself the luxury of a bath in a mug of warm water when a salvo of whiz-bangs burst between my hole and Company HQ. Followed an uncomfortable 15 minutes while the brutes continued to crash about us, 54 in all. They were directed at the little path which connected us, and damn good shooting too. Stood to as usual after dusk, and at 9 p.m, decided to wander up to Ewing's HQ for a walk. Followed the little path, now pitted by 6 direct shell hits, up a steep slippery bank to a trench whence a Lewis gun glared at me, and a challenge was hurled. Further along the trench, by some earth steps, was the figure of our little treasure, Sergeant Major Chalk. He directed me to Ewing's dugout, almost opposite the steps. I sent Dunham off to see Martin, and entered the shelter where Ewing was making out his reports by candlelight. He was not very thrilled on seeing me, and having offered me a drink, he went on with his work. I poured myself out a whiskey and watched him for a couple of minutes, until there was the rustle of an oil sheet and a clank of rifle on steel hat, and entered Quartermaster Sergeant Braham with a natty salute. He reported rations delivered, and asked if we wanted anything special from the Expeditionary Force canteen. Then, flinging the cape of his wetter over his shoulder, he dived into his pocket for the last canteen bill, which he handed to me with a grin. I was studying the items when there was a gasping and stumbling outside, and as we sprang up with drawn revolvers, a dishevelled figure rushed in and fell on Ewing's bed, laughing and gasping, "Whiskey! Whiskey!" We recognised him as Captain Melhuish of the 1 and 7th Worcesters, and having supplied him with the required beverage, we waited eagerly for his explanation of the mode of his entry. Laughing like an idiot, he told us that he had come up to look round our line as he was going to relieve us on the 21st. He had declined to bring a guide, as the position seemed so simple to find, and accompanied by his servant, he had left the main road and stepped off into the darkness in our direction. After walking for a long time, he had begun to think that he had gone wrong when he came to a large post full of troops. With a sigh of relief, he had jumped over the edge and slithered down, to find himself sitting staring into the faces of a group of Germans. He said that all had sat motionless with surprise for several seconds until his servant on top had spoken. Then, with a frantic yell of, "My God, they're Boche!" he had cleared the hole at a bound and beat it, followed by a fusillade of shots. He had not stopped running until he fell into our trench. When his tale was finished, I said cheerio to them and followed Braham out into the trench. We now noticed for the first time that the terrific rumble had recommenced to the north, and as we stood on the trench top, we could see the sky lighting and flickering above Bullecourt. The breeze was laden with moisture, and a few spots of rain began to fall as we started to return to our little home. The darkness was intense, and we had to feel our way along the strand of plain wire that led to my posts. It was raining heavily when we reached my hole, and walking fairly fast, I stepped straight into the trench, a sheer drop of 6 feet checked only when the point of my chin hit the top of an angle iron picket, which gave me a horrible, jagged cut. May 18th, walked about with a beard of bloody bandage all night. Fed up, did not go out on patrol. Trench full of water at dawn, and we crawled into our cubbyholes, miserably longing for the rum issue to recommence. Horribly wet when we crawled out again during the afternoon. Water in trench over our boots. It got dark early, and we were soon shivering in the line, watching our artillery pounding the German lines. This is their first decent effort during this tour, but it doesn't seem to worry the Boche any. Radcliffe did not come over during the night. May 19th, all quiet and uneventful. Message came up during the evening that we will be relieved tomorrow night. Cheers. Raddy spent most of the night with me, and we ate a lot and drank more to save carrying things out of the line with us. Dawn was in consequence much rosier, and I went to sleep feeling very cheery. May 20th, Sunday. I spent the wet afternoon checking the trench stores whilst the troops cleaned up the trench. All paper, tins, etc. were piled together ready to be buried at dusk. Then they got their packs ready. At dusk, the tins being buried, I sent off all men not actually on sentry and waited until 11 p.m. when, after a steady approach of jingling equipment through the darkness, a very young and very raw officer whispered down for the officer in charge. I hailed him down, and he crawled very gingerly in beside me in my little cubbyhole, while Sergeant Jowett carried his platoon off to the line to relieve our posts. Whilst telling the new arrival all about the geography of the position and getting his receipt for the stores, I plied him with whiskey in his own tin mug. Then I took him round the line, collected my relieved posts, and bidding him good night and good luck, set off back to Ewing's HQ. On entering, I found Radcliffe already there. Our troops were lying on the wet grass up top, and shortly afterwards Jimmy Harding joined us. I was glad to see him again. It's only a week since I last saw him, but it seems ages. May 21st. Bidding goodbye to Melhuish and his officers, we climbed out and in heavy rain moved the troops off in column of fours towards the road up which we had come in a week earlier. We did not strike it, however, for Ewing led us off to the right, and for a long time we marched over the torn fields. The rain increased until it was a regular downpour, and when we were well soaked, Ewing gave us the order to put on oil sheets. As we moved on after doing so, I noticed that he glanced continually at his map by the aid of a torch, and I guessed that he had lost his way. The troops guessed it too, and when he finally halted and confessed as much, a murmur of truculence arose which Radcliffe and I had much difficulty in quelling. However, SM Chalk set off into the darkness, and after a few minutes returned with the news that we were only half a mile from our destination. As we marched on again, I ventured to ask Ewing what our destination was, but he snapped, "You'll know when you get there." It was Chalk who told me that we were approaching a ruined village called Morches, where I was to remain with my platoon while the remainder of the battalion went into tents behind. While we were talking, we struck a broad wagon track which led in a curve to the left through a thick hedge and deposited us at what appeared to be a crossroads. In the darkness, we could just distinguish a road straight ahead and one to the left. Here Ewing halted and his stragglers closed up. It seems hardly credible, but he left me there with no orders other than that I was to stay with my platoon as escort to the guns hereabouts. To my questions concerning the position of the guns, my duties as escort, the location of his HQ, where my kit would be dumped, etc., I received the reply, "Don't waste my time now. Get off on your duty." So when he had marched straight on, I took the only road and bore to the left. Here the road was sunken, and into the steep bank were cut numerous dugouts. As these were unoccupied, I told my troops to make themselves comfortable in them while I had a look around. Dawn was breaking as I plodded up the road, and where the road was bounded by banks 16 feet high, the dugouts showed signs of occupation. Suddenly I was challenged in an unmistakably colonial voice, and in answer to my questions, the sentry, an Australian, indicated the officer's dugout, a large shelter built into the bank with a table, chair and gas gong outside. I opened the door quietly and saw an officer sitting at a table playing patience by the light of 2 candles, a whiskey glass beside him. He looked up, and seeing me, he spoke and acted simultaneously. "Come in and sit down," and a fist shot out with a clean glass. He poured me a whiskey as I unbuckled my equipment, and I liked the look of him. He was remarkably handsome, with very large blue eyes and silvery white curly hair. He had no collar or tie, and his open tunic bore the Australian badge on the lapels. As I drank my whiskey, he told me that he was in command of that battery of Australian artillery, and that he had been waiting up for me. I told him I had never heard of such an escort before, and could he tell me what it was and why. But he waved a brown hand at me. "Tomorrow, Sonny, tomorrow. I'm dead tired and you ought to be, so let's get to bed. Have you got your kit?" I told him no. "Oh, we'll soon fix that," he replied, and leaning back he yelled into what appeared to be an enormous grave which I had not noticed hitherto. 2 figures were squirming about, and in response to his announcement of my arrival, each handed up a blanket. I did not want to take them, but he smothered my protests by wrapping them round my head and pushing me out of the door. Extricating myself, I followed him into a tin hut on the roadside where he lit a hurricane lamp and dragged the mattress from his bed onto the floor. Adding one of his own blankets, he ran out before I could argue and left me to settle in. Waking to a bright midday sun, I lay looking at my untidy surroundings and wondering what the loud bangs were that I could hear. Only half awake, I thought they were the Australian guns, and that I ought to be escorting them. But as I jumped up, I realised that they were crashes, not bangs, and uncomfortably near too. I slipped on my tunic and went out into the road, bathed in dazzling sunlight. My side of the road was littered with evidence of troops' occupation helmets, bully tins, buckets, wood, shell cases, etc. The other side was bare except for a military well, and a large crowd of troops who were lying flat against the bank. The reason for this was obvious. Behind us was a village of mingled red roofs and trees, which extended to the corner where we had parted from Ewing last night. And at this corner now was a large cloud of red dust, into which shell after shell was falling with deadly regularity and precision. The chunks of shrapnel and brick were falling about me, so I did not stand still for long. I grabbed my tin hat and joined my platoon on the bank. When I realised that it was only my fellows who were on that side of the road, and that the few Australian gunners who had worried to come out were sitting on their own side, smoking and watching the shelling, I felt quite ashamed, and returned to my bedroom to put on my puttees before going into their mess. I found the skipper with his two subs, one very small and dark black eyes, hair and toothbrush known as Gary, the other a silent, dull-looking chap called Jack. They greeted me very hospitably and chipped me about the windiness of my troops. While I explained that they had not been subjected to shelling for some time and would have to get used to it again, Gary fished out a gramophone, and we listened to some cheery review records until a servant appeared with lunch. They were very familiar with this servant, and Christian names were freely interchanged. During an excellent lunch, I heard how some months before a party of 30 Boche had managed to get through our line to a battery of guns in this position. They had surprised and killed the gunners, spiked the guns and returned. They had been wiped out on trying to return through our posts, but ever since a platoon had been detailed to assist in defending the guns. The skipper pointed out to me a pile of shell boxes, which he said contained a supply of shrapnel fused to burst at point blank, which he guaranteed would keep the Boche at 200 yards if he ever did get so near again. The shelling continued until 3 p.m., by which time we reckoned about 400 must have fallen. The troops had got used to them very early on and were walking about freely, but I noticed that they did not mix with the Australians. Rather, they acted on the popular distrust and kept a wary eye on their belongings. At 3:30, I walked along to the troops' dugouts to inspect them. They were a wretched lot of holes and needed improving badly, so I made out an indent for 300 sandbags, which I gave to Dunham, telling him to go and find my kit, and to find HQ. Then I had the troops out for a rifle inspection and half an hour's gas drill. Then tea. After dark, Dunham returned, wheeling a comic old trolley with my valise soaked in water. He said he had found it lying where it had been dumped in a big pool. He was accompanied by Berry and Cooper, both of B Company. They have only come for accommodation, I think. Cooper is a very young, childish-faced second lieutenant, with a frequent mirthless laugh and idiotic conversation. He has already jarred my nerves by wandering about singing repeatedly, "Brown bread well buttered," which are the only words he knows of some senseless song. Berry is a good-hearted chap, but very foul-mouthed and loud-voiced. He drinks far too much, and when he turned up this evening he was very tight. He is going on leave tomorrow. I have been particularly struck by the niceness of the Australians' conversation. They never swear, and their ordinary talk is very gentle and homely, the kind and intelligent discussions contrasting sharply with the coarse or harsh inanities that resound in the messes of most British units. They seem to have a tremendous respect and admiration for their skipper too, although they are all so familiar. As soon as Berry and Cooper arrived, Jack and Gary cleared their belongings out of the grave to make room for them, and I moved my valise into the mess so that they could join their skipper. Then we all sat down to dinner. May 22nd. When I rose for breakfast at 8 a.m., Berry had had his and was dressed in marching order ready to go on leave. He suddenly remembered that he had no money, so I lent him 40 francs. Then he shook hands and stumped off towards the village while I sat down to breakfast. The Australians are messing by themselves in future in the tin hut, and as Cooper was still asleep, I had breakfast alone. Bridge and Pepper turned up during the morning and took over the grave, Cooper being pushed out to an adjacent cubbyhole. It was a frightfully hot day, and the troops wandered about the road playing pitch and toss or nearest the line, clad only in tin hats, linen shorts and boots. The shelling was repeated at midday, but was ignored by the troops, except for a small clique, including, of course, Mackay and Newey, who arranged a small sweepstake as to which particular house would escape damage. I spent the morning overhauling my kit and putting out things for Dunham to clean. Pepper and Bridge wander about on their own and have very little to say to me. I had a kit inspection in the afternoon, and at dusk went with Gary to see the positions which we would occupy in case of alarm. Starting from the road junction on our left, we pushed out through the hedge towards a clump of trees a couple of 100 yards in front. This proved to be one of those charming French calvaries, a horseshoe of bushy trees enclosing a small mound whereon stood a huge crucifix. One of the trees had been felled by a shell, and a tiny graveyard behind was pitted with shell holes. This had evidently been used as a ranging mark by the artillery of one side or the other. The post which we were to work upon now, and occupy in case of attack, was immediately in front of the graveyard, and commanded a fine view of the valley which ran forward towards the Boche. As I stood surveying the field of fire with the critical eye of the infantryman, my attention was caught by a salvo of pink shrapnel bursts at the far end of the valley. Then a crowd of troops appeared, running full tilt down the road, relentlessly pursued by the pretty pink Spitfires. The shelling stopped when they were about 300 yards from us, leaving me with a certain knowledge that the road is under enemy observation. We then moved straight off to our right, visiting a series of similar posts at intervals, 150 yards in front of our sunken road. Just behind the posts stood the guns, absolutely in the open, and covered with camouflage sheets. Since dinner I have been making out indents for my troops' deficiencies of kit and playing patience. Pepper and Bridge have gone off to one of the other messes, and Cooper, thank God, is in with the Australians. May 23rd, same old shelling, frightfully close, but did no damage. We are used to it now, so we were not disturbed, but the village is looking very haggard, and there is hardly a house left standing. We spent the afternoon doing gas drill and rifle exercises, much to the disgust of the troops who do not like doing work when we are isolated, and, as they imagine, uncontrolled. At dusk we went out to the cavalry post and did a little work. We were unable to do any wiring, which is really needed, as we had no cutters or gloves. When we returned at 9 o'clock, we found that a hot meal had been sent up from behind. This being our first for a week caused great satisfaction to the troops. May 24th. I wanted to ask the adjutant to send me up some wiring materials, so early this morning I went into the Australian signal dugout and asked them to get me through. When the old D3 receiver was handed to me, I heard Hoskins' voice at the other end. I said, "This is Vaughan speaking. I want some wire cutters and gloves sent up this evening for work on my posts." He didn't seem to understand, so I said, "You know I am acting as escort to the guns." But here he shouted, "Shut up at once and ring off," and put down his instrument, leaving me utterly bewildered. I left the signallers grinning at my embarrassment and returned to the dugout to send off the message by runner. I found Willis waiting with a message from Radcliffe, a cheery little note saying, "Do come round to tea and cheer us up." At lunchtime another note arrived from Hoskins, saying that I was wanted at HQ during the afternoon. I was very puzzled by this note, not having an inkling of what I was wanted for. Leave, promotion, special jobs, all kinds of ideas passed through my head as I dressed after lunch, making myself as smart and clean as possible, much to the amusement of Bridge and Pepper, who kept up a running fire of criticism and sarcastic advice. Finally, at 4 o'clock, accompanied by Dunham, I set off with my tin hat at the exact angle, and an inch of green stocking showing above my highly polished trench boots. There was no shelling in the village, for which I was indescribably grateful, for during a strafe it is a veritable death trap. It was a blazing afternoon, and we found it hot work climbing round shell holes and over the piles of brickwork that obliterated the road. Every bit of wall that was standing was scarred and chipped, and the whole village reeked of lyddite and stale brick dust. Only the trees and bushes which have overgrown the place retained their freshness, and the bright greenery gave a soothing touch to the awful scene of destruction. We only saw one man in the village, a military policeman at the centre crossroads. We passed right through the village, and then Dunham led me off to the left along the very last wall, which was quite unmarked, and close to which we found HQ. They were at tea outside their tents, Colonel Hanson, Hoskins, Mortimer, and Captain Taylor. The latter wore a brilliantly coloured silk handkerchief round his head, brigand fashion, and all the others were in the last stages of deshabille shorts and shirts only, lying about on the grass or sprawled on boxes. As I approached, I heard the commanding officer say, "Who on earth is this?" Whereupon all turned and stared until Mortimer said, "It's Vaughan," and everybody laughed. I saluted and stood blushing with shame while they found nothing to say except "Good afternoon." Then, after a long, awkward silence, I stammered out that Hoskins had sent for me. The confounded little pup said, "Oh yes, so I did," as if he had forgotten about it. Then he drew me aside and said, "I wanted to speak about your foolish remark on the phone this morning. You should know that it is a court-martial offence to say anything which could give information to the enemy. Every message is picked up by them. Now Hoskins is only a second lieutenant acting captain, and he's never done any service in the line. So I was not inclined to take a choke-off from him. I interrupted him furiously and told him that I knew all he did about anything, and that I had said nothing on the phone which could teach the Boche anything. There were batteries all over France and escorts too, and I might have been any one of them. Under my tirade he caved in and changed to a conciliatory tone, saying that he had only meant to give me a friendly hint in case I did not know. I cut the conversation off by saluting the commanding officer from a distance and making my way back to the road, being joined by Dunham, who all this time had been picking flowers through a hole in the wall. We returned to where the MP was on duty, then turned to the left. There were a few ruined houses on either side of the road, then it ran out into the open, screened on either side by a low bank. Just past the last house on the left was a small pond, whence protruded the grey-clad knee of a dead German. The water around him was green, and on his knee was perched a large rat making a meal. The bank nearer the Boche was honeycombed with shelters for troops. The first ones were occupied by Australians who took no notice of us. But they were very jolly, and as they lay about basking in the sunshine, we were accompanied by a buzz of talk and laughter as we traversed the few hundred yards that brought us to the whiter faces and cleaner billets of No. 16 platoon. All these lads stood up as we approached, and each salute to me was followed by a greeting to Dunham, who is immensely popular throughout the company. He took their homage as I took their salutes, things to be expected as due to superior rank, and he acknowledged them in the same way. Dear old Dunham! His 4 months' association with the mess has made him feel a part of the company administration, and in his dealings with the other men he shows a condescension and authority that many NCOs would do well to emulate, and which increase the respect with which he is treated. He had grown out of the stupidity which caused Hatwell to give him to me, and is now my most valuable possession. The company mess was the last cubbyhole in the road, and entering I found Radcliffe and Harding, the latter, fast asleep. Radcliffe seemed very glad to see me, and arm in arm we went out into the sunshine and walked up and down the road. He told me that Ewing was becoming unbearable. Being aware of his shortcomings and terrified of appearing incompetent as a company commander, he was continually strafing and fussing about, particularly harassing his 2 unfortunate subalterns. I gave him a description of my life as escort to the guns, which made him very envious. Then, seeing Martin enter the mess with a teapot, we followed him in and tipped Jimmy Harding out of his chair onto the grass-covered floor. Dear old Jimmy sat rubbing his eyes, and in a tearful voice bemoaned the fact that he had no friend in the world, and that his forced acquaintances had no respect for his old age. We consoled him and coaxed him to sit at table with us, which he consented to do the more readily as a new tin of curried prawns had just arrived from the canteen. I was just getting up when Ewing himself came in. He was in shorts and carried his tin hat fastened under his shoulder strap, so I guessed that he had been reconnoitring. But as he sat down and commenced to eat in moody silence, we refrained from questioning him, and continued the light conversation that always prevails amongst officers, the recalling of past stunts, debating the present situation and surmising the future. Soon the prawns began to whisper to Ewing that he was being unsociable, and he ventured a few shy remarks. Eventually he told us that we were to move up to the line again on the 29th to the same sector, only that the positions of the platoons would be changed. I remained until it was dark, and then thought it was time to rejoin my platoon. I routed out Dunham and set off back, Raddy and Harding walking with me to the crossroads. Parting from them, I decided to take a shortcut through the ruined houses and gardens, but having started, I soon regretted it, for away from the road and in the shade of the trees, the darkness was intense, and we floundered about amongst shell holes, piles of bricks, prickly bushes, broken ploughs, and all sorts of obstacles. The excursion was, needless to say, a very profane one, until we struck a fairly clear patch. Here we halted for a moment to take breath, and there were 4 terrific and blinding simultaneous explosions. We flung ourselves to earth and lay grovelling in a panic, until a shouted order and the clink of shell cases told us that we had walked onto one of our batteries. With badly shaken nerves, we hurried behind it and raced on until we dropped into the road that was our home. The battery kept up a monotonous fire long after I had settled my nerves with a stiff drink.